Sanders first, and he's going to be talking about Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, the media manipulation and perception, which I think is one of the key reasons why this room is full, because most of you realise that what you're being shown on the media is really, a lot of it is just a load of rubbish, or not necessarily a load of rubbish, but there's a lot of important stuff they're just not telling you, or they're twisting it in certain ways so that you're not encouraged to pay attention to certain things which you should be paying attention to. So without further ado, I'm now going to ask Neil to join me at the front.
All right, hello. Oh, bless. Thank you very much, but I might be crap, so, you know. Okay, so, I'm in the way as well. There we go. Right, well, thank you everyone for coming. To be quite honest, this is brilliant. I didn't expect that many people to turn up. I thought, to be honest, I'd be able to wing it through this and just not do it. But yeah, sorry, in the end, we very nearly had to turn my own mother away, so that's good. I mean, it's not good that I had to turn my mother away, it's good that so many people have turned up, so brilliant. So what I'm going to talk about, usually what I talk about is pretty grim stuff, to be honest. It's like sort of personal mind control and sort of, you know, trauma-based mind control and stuff like that. It's often a bit gory and it's often quite traumatic. It's not really going to be like that today, I'm afraid, so apologies for that. It's going to be more about sort of the media and I mean, the point is, why have you guys had to come here? Because we've got a great day today. We've got Andrew, who's brilliant. We've got Richard D. Hall, who I'm sure you all know, and Lloyd Pye, who, again, fantastic speaker. And these guys, these are bright guys, right? These are really, really intelligent guys. They're going to present you with facts. They're not just going to come out there and be wishy-washy. What they're going to do is they're going to actually eloquently present an argument. And it's not ridiculous, it comes with evidence, it's all, you know, well thought out and stuff like that. You might not agree with everything that they say, but it's a valid argument. So why have you guys got to come here to actually see this? Why is this not on the mainstream media? Well, that's what my talk's going to be about, and hopefully we will understand at the end. So, just to start then, Edward Bernays. Thank you. He's the father of public relations, and he strongly believed that the masses should be manipulated at a subconscious level in order to promote the survival of democracy, or more accurately, democracy really means the established hierarchical order of the elite. Now, Bernays actually shared with the American intellectual Walter Lippmann the view of the general population as an irrational collective controlled by their instinctual return to the herd instinct. Now, hopefully some of you guys have read the book or seen the book by Dr. John Coleman, the Tavistock Institute. In that, basically, John Coleman proves that Bernays and Lippmann were actually intrinsically tied to the Tavistock Institute and also the Tavistock's precursor, Wellington House. Okay, there we go. Right, so the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations is a charity organisation concerned with social control and applying psychological warfare methods to countries in order to create dissent, create fear and reduce the morale of the population. It actually began in the UK in 1921, and in 1932 Tavistock was put under the directorship of Kurt Lewin. Now, Kurt Lewin is a German psychiatrist, and he was a founder member of the OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA. So immediately, right, prior to the Second World War, we can see the interlocking of the three major intelligence agencies. Now, Kurt Lewin was interested in mass brainwashing and applying repeated trauma and torture in mind control to society at large. And by an amazing coincidence, this actually appears to be a strikingly similar time to the Nazis' interest in mind control, although I'm sure that that is actually just a coincidence. Now, the Tavistock Clinic, which was the precursor to the Tavistock Institute, was founded in London in 1920 by Dr. Hugh Crichton Miller. Now, he was a psychiatrist who was developing psychological treatments for shell-shocked soldiers who were returning home from the First World War. But what's more likely is that actually they were studying these shell-shocked soldiers to see what is the psychological breaking point of man, and then see how this can be applied on a social level, basically. Now, mind control researcher and author Jim Keith, who's sadly now deceased, wrote, Tavistock is a collaborative effort of British military intelligence and the psychiatric establishment and was created in 1921, reportedly on the orders of members of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as Chatham House. The RIIA is an arm of the British Rhodes Round Table Group, founded by British imperialist and Freemason Cecil Rhodes. The Round Table, functioning through a myriad of offshoots, has been this century's most effective proponent for the creation of a one-world government. Tavistock relies on grants for its operations from the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the British Home Office, and from large anonymous sources. Tavistock is basically interested in crowd control, authority and training for business and world leaders, and PSYOPs, or psychological operations. And it was actually Tavistock that suggested carpet bombing civilians during war times in order to induce terror. A little known fact is, although Germany had bombed Guernica as a test for this, under the Tavistock RAF strategic bombing campaign, the RAF actually bombed civilians in Freiburg many weeks before Germany actually bombed civilians in England as well. So, now Kurt Lewin was the director of Tavistock from 1932, and he said if terror can be introduced on a widespread basis into society, it will revert to a blank state where control can be instituted from an exterior point. I mean, what this means is by the creation of controlled chaos, the general populace can be brought to the point where it willingly submits to greater control from an outside point. And to me, this sounds remarkably similar to the Freemasonic maxim, order out of chaos. But again, I'm sure that's just a coincidence. Also, coincidentally, Tavistock happens to call its collections of psychiatrists an invisible college. Now, if anybody knows like that, an invisible college is a Freemasonic mystery school term for a collection of people who are involved, basically. But again, I'm sure this is just coincidence. Now, Lewin maintained that society must be driven into a state equivalent to an early childhood state situation, and he actually termed this societal chaos fluidity. And Lewin was very influential. He actually later took his expertise in research to America, where he was influential in founding the Stanford Research Institute, MIT, the National Institute of Mental Health, the Wharton School of Economics, and many other institutions, seemingly in order to further the influence of Tavistock and Tavistock's psychological operations on the global stage. Lewin was also influential in placing key figures in other institutions such as the Rand Corporation and the Esalen Institute, which hopefully some of you have heard of. Now, it was actually Tavistock founder John Rawlings Rees who originally envisaged an invisible army of what he termed shock troops. Now, these would be Tavistock agents who would be sent out and placed strategically in high positions to develop and nurture Tavistock projects. Now, these shock troops would be placed in any and every social and professional function and institute with a directive to influence in a clandestine manner. And in 1954, Rees actually explained the function of the shock troop. He said, "Their job is to apply the advanced techniques of psychological warfare as we know them to whole population groups that will grow even larger so that whole populations may be more easily controlled. In a world driven completely mad by Tavistock, I might add, groups of Tavistock psychologists linked to each other, capable of influencing the political and governmental field, must be the arbiters. They must be the power cabal." Now, in a particularly candid explanation of this particular method of overpowering the will of the individual, Kurt Lewin said, "The inner self of the individual displays certain reactions when under tension from the environment. When there is no tension, then the normal inner self of a person is well differentiated, balanced, multifaceted, and versatile. When a reasonable amount of tension is applied from the environment, then all the various abilities and faculties of the inner self go on alert, ready for effective action. But when an intolerable amount of tension is applied, then this geometry collapses into a blinded, undifferentiated soup, a primitive, a regressed personality. The person is reduced to an animal. The highly differentiated and versatile abilities disappear, and the controlled environment takes over the personality." Now, by controlling perception of the world through language, Tavistock also helps direct world events. Tavistock rose directly from Wellington House. Wellington House was the propaganda organisation that was able to alter public opinion in order to position the public as willing participants in the First World War. Now, this was achieved partly in America, certainly, by characterising those who were opposed to the war as isolationists. Now, utilising the new techniques of communication media, the television and the radio and such, the term isolationist was actually used as a derogatory description of any American citizen who held a contrary opinion to the need for the US to be join into the war. Now, the organisation, namely Tavistock, was using shame and fear of standing out from the crowd to mould public opinion. terms like regime change, which actually mean a military takeover, and collateral damage, which actually means the death of women, children, civilians. They were introduced by Tavistock as well, and these are basically used to soften off the harsh realities of war. And it's actually with methods like this that Tavistock is able to form public opinion to the point where people believe that their own thoughts are actually organic. Now, Bernays and Lippmann argued that the populace needed to be manipulated by an invisible government secretly working behind the scenes out of the view of the mainstream, and this would ensure the survival of the presently held democracy. Bernays described the necessity for this in his 1928 work Propaganda, and this is a quote that you've probably heard before. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organised habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is the logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organised. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. Now, Bernays himself actually acknowledged the labyrinthine nature of this organised manipulation, stating, "Our invisible governors are, in many cases, unaware of the identity of their fellow members of the inner cabinet." Bernays' trailblazing marketing campaigns profoundly changed the behaviour of American society, then ultimately the world, and this was by introducing and popularising the concept of consumerism. Now, this was achieved by creating a culture wherein Americans actually bought for their own personal pleasure rather than as previously for necessity or out of survival. And Bernays was actually credited as being the inventor of the press release and was later honoured in the publication Life magazine by being placed in the top 100 most influential Americans of the 20th century. Now, he actually clarified his position and his elitist ideals in his book Propaganda, where he stated, "Propaganda is merely the executive arm of the invisible government." Now, in the 1920s, Bernays developed an advertising campaign persuading women to smoke cigarettes. Now, he helped the tobacco industry overcome one of the biggest social taboos of the time, which was namely women smoking in public. Smoking was at the time considered a masculine pursuit, and to be seen smoking as a woman was terribly uncouth, I'm afraid. Now, Bernays staged a promotional event at the 1929 Easter Parade in London, in New York City, ensuring that dozens of attractive debutantes were seen proudly wafting cigarettes by large numbers of the public. The event, although completely manufactured, was reported in the news as an important organic story. Now, using the example of the effectiveness of the technique, Bernays managed to convince industries that the news rather than advertising was to become the most useful medium with which to carry their message to an unsuspecting public. The episode would not be thought of as merely a promotional campaign in the eyes of the public, but rather as a cultural event, and this is why this is happening today. Working for the American Tobacco Company, he sent a group of young models to march in the New York City parade, and then he told the press that a group of women's rights marchers would light torches of freedom on his signal. And when he gave the signal, they all proudly struck up some Lucky Strike cigarettes in front of the eager photographers. Now, this resulted in the New York Times in April 1929 printing the headline, "Group of girls puff at cigarettes as gesture of freedom." And this is basically how they do it. This is ridiculous. This was a completely manufactured event, an advertising campaign that was sold to the public as a genuine news story. And that was basically the first time that they'd done it, and they do it every day now. Bernays was particularly skilled at manipulating the psychological processes that affect people's behaviour, and he was never hesitant to exploit this in his promotional campaigns. One of Bernays' favourite techniques for manipulating public opinion was the indirect use of third-party authorities to plead his client's case. What this is an authority figure. So this is why we see 8 out of 10 doctors recommend this, 8 out of 10 dentists recommend this, even 8 out of 10 cats recommend this, okay? That's where it comes, because psychologically we're wired to see if somebody who we believe to be an authority figure in the know says something, we'll go, oh, no, bro, sounds plausible, yeah, why not? Bernays said, if you can influence the leaders, either with or without their conscious cooperation, you can automatically influence the group with which they sway. For example, in order to promote the sales of bacon, he conducted a survey of physicians and reported their recommendation that people eat heavy breakfasts. This was not their medical recommendation, this was just a conversational recommendation. However, he took the fact that these doctors had recommended a heavy breakfast, sent it to 5,000 other doctors who said, well, yeah, if they say so, we'll agree with it, and then basically started promoting bacon and eggs as a heavy breakfast. This is why, still to this day, we're told that the most important breakfast meal of the day is breakfast. Maybe this is why we've got such an obesity crisis, to be quite honest. Bernays was also responsible for the promotion of the use of fluoride in water supplies and later toothpaste, helping the Aluminium Company of America, which is now called Alcoa, to convince the American public that water fluoridation was not only safe but also beneficial to human health, specifically their teeth. Now, this was achieved by using members of the American Dental Association as an example of an authoritarian organisation that knows what's best for the public. And this was done in a highly successful media campaign. Fluoridization of the water supplies had, until that time, been most successfully utilised by Nazi Germany in order to sedate and befuddle concentration camp prisoners. However, the public actually trusted the media-sanctioned authority figures. Well, why would they? As a young company, CBS Media Communications employed Bernays to run their public communications operations, allowing him regular access to unprecedented numbers of consumers. In his publication, The Engineering of Consent, which was published in 1947, Bernays stated, "The engineering of consent is the very essence of the democratic process, the freedom to persuade and to suggest." French social psychologist and sociologist Gustave Le Bon was the author of several works in which he expounded theories of herd behaviour and crowd psychology, and how these events can be manipulated in order to impose control of the masses. He suggested that when people come together in crowds, they start to identify with the group at large instead of as an individual. The opinions of the crowd become the opinions of each person, like mass hypnosis. And this is exactly why people, very sensible people, get caught up in riots, because basically you become part of a larger group. Le Bon described it as a phenomenon of which it is easy to establish the presence, but which it is not easy to explain. It must be classed among the phenomenon of a hypnotic order. In a group, every sentiment and act is contagious, and contagious to such a degree that an individual readily sacrifices his personal interest to the collective interest. This is an aptitude very contrary to his nature, and of which man is scarcely capable except when he makes part of a group. Now, Walter Lippmann was the American intellectual. He was a writer and a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and he shared Bernays' view of the general public. Lippmann was a graduate of Harvard and a member of the fraternity Phi Beta Kappa. He was an informal advisor to several presidents and was actually awarded with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964 by President Lyndon Johnson, who is somebody who, as I think we probably know, can't be trusted. He is credited with being one of the first to categorize the paranoid dread of nuclear death that permeated the latter part of the 20th century by giving it a name and a conceptual idea that the public could fearfully cling to. Basically what he did was he categorized and named the Cold War. Now, in his most famous work, Public Opinion, Lippmann compared the masses to a great beast and a bewildered herd that needed for its own good to be guided by a responsible governing class, namely the established order of the elite. Now, he described the ruling class as a specialized class whose interests reach beyond the locality. Now, in Lippmann's considered view, the bewildered herd, that's us, has its function to be the interested spectators of action, meaning that the majority of people should not participate in anything of any real importance. The direction of the general public's lives are directed and dictated for them by the intelligentsia of the ruling classes. Participation in the running of the world, in Lippmann's opinion, was the duty of the responsible man, namely the elites, rather than the average man in the street. And one important concept presented by Lippmann was the manufacture of consent, which is very similar to Bernays' engineering of consent, which is, in short, the manipulation of public opinion to accept the specific agenda of the ruling class. In Lippmann's opinion, the general public was not qualified to reason and to decide on the most important issues, and it was therefore important for the elites to decide for their own good and then sell those decisions back to the masses. He said that the manufacture of consent is capable of great refinements no one, I think, denies. The process by which public opinions arise is certainly no less intricate than it has appeared in these pages, and the opportunities for manipulation open to anyone who understands this process are plain enough. As a result of psychological research, coupled with the modern means of communication, the practice of democracy has turned a corner. A revolution is taking place, infinitely more significant than any shifting of economic power. Under the impact of propaganda, not necessarily in the sinister meaning of the word, the old constants of our thinking have become variables. It is no longer possible, for example, to believe in the original dogma of democracy, that the knowledge needed for the management of human affairs comes up spontaneously from the human heart. Where we act on that theory, we expose ourselves to self-deception and to forms of persuasion that we cannot verify. It has been demonstrated that we cannot rely upon intuition, conscience, or the accidents of casual opinion if we are to deal with a world beyond our reach. Now, in the opening chapter of Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, the opening chapter is titled The World Outside and Pictures in Our Heads. Now, in this, he explained that the pictures in people's minds are the way that they see things, and their assumptions of what is real, and that this is how people interpret their roles and their positions in the world. People's understanding of the world through these conceptualized pictures denotes how people conduct themselves in everyday situations. And he said the object of study of the public opinion socioanalyst is reality is defined by internal perceptions or images of that reality. Public opinion deals with indirect, unseen and puzzling facts, and there is nothing obvious about them. The situations to which the public opinions refer are known as opinions. The pictures inside the heads of these human beings, the pictures of themselves, of others, of their needs, purposes and relationships, are their public opinions. Those pictures which are acted upon by groups of people or by individuals acting in the name of groups are public opinion with capital letters. The picture inside so often misleads men in their dealing with the world outside. Lippmann then explained how this can be employed in the manipulation of opinions. He said, this then will be the clue to our inquiry. We shall assume that what each man does is based not on direct and certain knowledge, but on pictures made by himself or given to him. If his atlas tells him that the world is flat, he will not sail near what he believes to be the edge of the planet for fear of falling off. If his map includes a fountain of eternal youth, a Ponce de Leon will go in quest of it. If someone digs up yellow dirt that looks like gold, he will for a time act exactly as if he had found gold. The way in which the world is imagined determines at any particular moment what men will do. It does not determine what they will achieve, it determines their efforts, their feelings and their hopes, but not their accomplishments and results. Now, going back to public opinion, Lippmann defined propaganda as such. On the formulation of by propaganda of a class-conscious group, but what is propaganda, if not the effort to alter the picture to which men respond, to substitute one social pattern for another? What is class consciousness, but a way of realising the world? National consciousness, but another way. Now, Lippmann actually believed that there must exist an independent public opinion organisation that makes unseen facts available to the politicians, the media and the heads of industry whilst controlling the pictures that the general public receive. He said, I argue that representative government, either in what is ordinarily called politics or in industry, cannot be worked successfully no matter what the basis of election, unless there is an independent, expert organisation for making the unseen facts intelligible to those who have to make the decisions. My conclusion is that public opinion must be organised for the press if they are to be sound, not by the press, as is the case today. Now, it might be interesting to note that Lippmann was actually one of the founding fathers of the Council of Foreign Relations, or the CFR, which is one of the most influential foreign policy think tanks in the world today. So, how can all these techniques be used to sway public opinion? Oh, there we go. Now, the use of polls in various media outlets can actually be an incredibly effective way of directing rather than recording public opinion. Due to the human psychological need to form tribes, we as creatures do not like to find ourselves in the minority. The concept of a poll coming from an established organisation invokes a father-like figure of authority whom again we are psychologically wired to go along with. As an example, if a poll appears showing that the vast majority of people are in favour of an approaching war, The strength of public opinion may feel so strong that we find it difficult to go against the grain. Also, polls imply facts. We subconsciously absorb the results and we can take this as a reliable gauge of public belief. If we see several polls that show a particular politician is the most popular, we will take this on as the accepted truth. Later we may say Obama is the most popular or Romney is the most popular because we've seen it in a poll. And then by repetition of this fact, this becomes an accepted truism in the lexicon of social life. Now, the result of said surveys can also be manipulated in a number of ways. Firstly, the company behind it may just lie to make their point. Secondly, they may skew to statistics to make a decision seem more popular on the face of it. For example, if I interviewed one person who was in favour of a war, I could say that statistically 100% of people interviewed are in favour of a war. If I repeated the survey with a larger group but only interviewed people who would not fight but would make a financial gain from war, I would get a similar result. This is not, however, an accurate representation of the feelings of the general public. The result of surveys can also be swayed by skillful framing of the subject. For example, if I asked, are you scared of nuclear war? Are you concerned about the amount of civilian casualties caused by conflict? Are you concerned about the illegal nature of the wars that this country fights? Are you in favour of the approaching war? You would get diametrically opposed answers if I asked, are you fearful of tyrants and despots? Are you wary of dictators gaining access to powerful weapons? Do you think that we should use our country's strengths to help liberate those who are under totalitarian regimes? Are you in favour of the approaching regime change? Now, the embarrassment factor can also be used to shape your opinions. The analytical part of your brain can effectively be shut down by keeping you in line with shame. If an idea can be framed as ridiculous, the listener usually won't bother examining it any closer to find out if the ridicule is justified. Statements can be framed as such a matter as, well, some people think 9/11 was an inside job, but that's only something that an idiot would think. And you guys, you're not idiots, are you? Okay, now this physically affects you. This isn't just like a societal thing. This is a physical response of the area of your brain called the amygdala. And these basically control primitive emotional reactions. This is the area from which negative emotions such as contempt and shame bubble up from. Stimulating this can actually produce a powerful reaction within the brain, and it can effectively shut down the analytical processes of the individual. The instinctive fight or flight mechanism can be instantly evoked by offering narrow avenues of action with black or white choices. And this can be combined with the use of fear to force people to make snap decisions. For example, you've probably heard this, they hate every aspect of our existence. We must attack them or else. In such an artificially induced stress scenario, complex analytical thought is not an option. You will have to come to an immediate conclusion, perhaps turning to an authority figure for advice. This stress can also appeal to our more natural instincts to form tribes, forcing us into a scenario of us versus them. The more stress we feel, the more we feel love and attachment towards those who look and sound the same as us. We feel more hatred towards those who are not in our gang. And this has been used many, many times. You are either with us or against us, and anyone who is against us is on the side of the terrorists. Repetition of a desired truth can also work in a similar manner to the introduction of polling results. Research has actually revealed that if only one member of a group repeats their opinion more than once, it is more likely to be seen by others as representative of the whole group. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology examined exactly this situation to test how people judge the distribution of opinion. The study, carried out by Dr. Kimberly Weaver and colleagues, found we can tell that 3 people expressing the same opinion better represents the group than one person expressing the same opinion 3 times, but not by much. And the study showed that actually if one person in a group repeats the same opinion 3 times, it has the 90% of the effect of 3 different people in the group expressing the same opinion. Now similarly, and more worryingly, when an opinion is repeatedly broadcast at us by the same organisation, think of any particular news organisation or advertiser, we are likely to come to believe that it represents the general opinion. And this is despite the fact that it is analogous to the same person repeating themselves over and over again. And this process has actually been shown many times in studies concerning repetition, and this particular study was taken by the Psychiatry Department of McMaster University, Ontario. So people rate statements that have been repeated just once as more valid or true than things that they have heard for the first time. They even rate statements as truer when the person repeating them has been proven to be a liar. Now, some studies have actually tested how many times a message should be repeated for maximum effect, and these suggest that people have a maximum confidence in an idea that is repeated between 3 and 5 times. Now, if anyone is a teacher here, you'll know that basically this is repeated in teaching practice in the UK. Repetition of facts between 3 and 5 times seems to make people stick. On a completely separate instance, I have a book coming out, so if anyone wants to buy my book, buy my book, buy my book,
yes, master.
Feel free. Okay, right, now this is frightening. Repetition is effective almost across the board when people are paying little attention. But when they're concentrating and the argument is weak, often the effect disappears. Now on the face of it, that sounds right, brilliant, okay, fine, so we just examine everything that we see. That's impossible. What this actually means, frighteningly, is that advertising is far more effective when you're not fully paying attention to it. Okay, this is by this psychological process that we unknowingly learn the words to songs, catchphrases, telephone numbers, things like this. They basically embed themselves in the subconscious. This is why we know slogans and jingles and things like that without actually having an interest in the product. Now, by appealing to laterally occurring manifestations of herd mentality and groupthink, large numbers of people can actually have their opinions and actions dictated. The larger a group, the harder it is for an individual to stand opposed to their ethos. Therefore, the larger a group, the more easily they are coerced into a specific action or mind frame. Now, when you actually watch television, you go into an alpha state brainwave pattern. Now, this is technically a hypnotic trance. The brain activity slows, and the subconscious, which, by the way, has no critical analysis, is spoken to directly. This is a one-way conversation with the part of your brain that stores learned behavior. The subconscious stores all our learned actions so that we don't have to consciously think about functions such as walking or breathing. If you've ever been driving and you've been daydreaming and suddenly realised that you're driving down a route to another direction, this is what's happened. Basically, you were not consciously thinking and your subconscious autopilot took over. Your conscious mind will only come into play in the presence of danger or distraction, or when basically you finally realise, oh God, I was supposed to be at work and instead I've driven to my mother's. Right? This is the state that you must be in to implant post-hypnotic suggestions. Studies have shown that watching television actually induces low alpha waves in the human brain, alpha waves being the brain waves between 8 to 12 hertz. In an experiment performed in 1969, Herbert Krugman monitored a test subject through a series of trials that investigated a person's response to watching television. Krugman discovered that in less than 1 minute from the beginning of viewing the television, the test subject's brainwave patterns switched from beta waves associated with active, logical thought and critical analysis to alpha waves. When the subject stopped watching television and began reading a magazine, the brainwaves reverted to beta waves. Now, one thing that this indicates is that most parts of the brain, the parts of the brain responsible for logical thought, tune out whilst watching television. The impact of television viewing on one person's brain state is obviously not enough to conclude that the same consequences apply to everyone. However, research involving many others completed in the years following Krugman's experiment has repeatedly shown that watching television produces brain waves in a low alpha range. Right. Advertisers have actually been aware of this for a long time, and they know how to take advantage of the passive, suggestible brain state of the television viewer. There is no need for an advertiser to use subliminal messages. The brain is already in what could be described as a receptive state. Technically, all an advertiser needs to do is associate their product with something that the viewer will deem as positive. However, we also have, like this, subliminal advertising. Yes?
Excuse me. I've always wondered, I thought that the TV puts you in a hypnotic state. Yeah. I don't watch a lot of TV now, but I do watch a lot of films on the internet. Does that do the same thing? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I believe it does. It's basically because of the way you sit there. It's partly to do with the flicker rate of the television, but it's basically just because it's a learned action. It's just the fact of sitting down, relaxing, and just watching something. It's just the fact that you've done it so many times that you can do it without thinking. In the same way as like driving and stuff like that, you don't have to think about changing gears anymore. It's not necessarily to do with the technology per se. It's not like the television. There's waves coming out of the television or anything like that. It's purely to do with the fact that you are doing this again and again and again. You can find yourself dropping into a daydream state in all sorts of things. I do it almost daily at work, basically. It helps pass the time. So, you know, but yeah, yes, you can do on the thing. But the thing about the internet is that basically, because often you're searching for things, typing and stuff like that, you've got the active part of your brain. But essentially, watching anything, watching any film, television program, anything like that, does drop you into an alpha state brainwave, basically. So, author and film technician Steve Jacobson summarised how television can actually be used to manipulate and influence the viewer without their knowledge. Subliminal perception is a deliberate process created by communications technicians which you receive and respond to information and instructions without being consciously aware of the instructions. Can everyone see the lady on top of the Coke can? Yeah. Yep. This is a genuine advert, by the way. So is the previous one. The previous one was a Heinz advert. That's a clever one. Rumours of subliminal messages in advertising are plentiful. A partially declassified CIA document dated 17th of January 1958 stated, "It may be that subliminal projection can be utilised in such a way as to feature a visual suggestion such as obey." Author and activist Martin A. Lee, in an interview printed in the February 1980 issue of the High Times magazine, quoted an anonymous CIA agent as saying, "Some thought was given to whether or not we could affect political outcomes by using subliminal perception on TV and radio." Can everyone see the writing on the side of the can? If you can't see it, it says sex. Now, despite public opinion that the concept of subliminal advertising is a myth, several studies have shown that the effective nature of the technique when employed correctly. University College, this was published in Science Daily in 2007. University College London researchers have found that the first physiological evidence that invisible subliminal images do attract the brain's attention on a subconscious level. The wider implication for the study, published in Current Biology, is that techniques such as subliminal advertising, now banned in the UK but still legal in the US, certainly do leave their mark on the brain. Using MRI scans, the study looked at whether an image you aren't aware of, but one that reaches the retina, has an impact on the brain's activity in the primary visual cortex. Subjects' brains did respond to the object even when they were not conscious of having seen it. Now, Dr. Barami of the UCL Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience and the UCL Department of Psychology said, "What's interesting here is that your brain does log things that you aren't even aware of and can't ever become aware of. We show that there is a brain response in the primary visual cortex to subliminal images that attract our attention, without us having the impression of having seen anything. These findings point to the sort of impact that subliminal advertising may have on the brain. What our study doesn't address is whether this would then influence you to go out and buy a product, but I believe it is likely that subliminal advertising may affect our decisions." Now, a year later, the following article was published in the same magazine. Although the idea that instrumental learning can occur subconsciously has been around for nearly a century, it has not been unequivocally demonstrated. Now, a new study published by Cell Press in the August 28th issue of the journal Neuron used sophisticated perception masking, computational modelling and neuroimaging to show that instrumental learning can occur in the human brain without conscious processing of the contextual clues. This is another one. This was in the ice cube down here. I missed that one. The researchers collected scans of the brain using functional magnetic resonance imaging to investigate the specific brain circuitry that is linked to subliminal instrumental conditioning. The ventral striatum responded to subliminal cues into visible outcomes in a manner that closely approximates our computational algorithm, expressing reward, expected values, and prediction errors. We conclude that even without conscious processing of contextual clues, our brain can learn their reward value and use them to provide bias on decision making. Now, the two studies there prove that in controlled experiments, the effectiveness of subliminal influence in manipulating unaware subjects. And this has happened many times. It was proven that images of protesters holding placards saying "keep abortion legal" were inserted into repeat showings of the television programme Batman, which was broadcast in 1994 and Channel 11 in Italy. In 1997, over 700 children in Japan were hospitalized with convulsions due to the Pokemon cartoon, which had induced photosensitive epilepsy-type seizures. Doctors at the time reported that the effects of the TV program were very similar to that of high-level hypnosis. Now, although some sources claim that subliminal advertising is ineffective or even an urban myth, the documented use of the technique in mass media proves that some unknown source within the industry believes in its powers. In 2000, an unidentified person or persons inserted the word rats into a political campaign television advertisement, and this advertisement had a pro-George Bush and an anti-Al Gore message. Now, the subliminal message is clearly evident when you actually the footage is slowed down. Now, recent studies have actually proven that the effectiveness of subliminals is heightened when the message is negative. A team from University College London, funded by the Wellcome Trust, found that subliminal perception was particularly good at instilling negative thoughts. There has been much speculation about whether people can process emotional information unconsciously, for example, pictures, faces and words. We have shown that people can perceive the emotional value of subliminal messages and have demonstrated conclusively that people are much more attuned to negative words. Now, some of you might know a bit about subliminal advertising, and basically it was the first sort of case of it was a guy called James Vickery, and this was done in 1957. And apparently what he did was he put a single frame into a film. One said drink Coca-Cola, one said eat popcorn, and it was reported to be an astounding success. There was something like 58% more Coke sales and 20% more sales of popcorn. Later, it was discovered that, or it was revealed or explained to the public that his experiment was actually a hoax, and so it was basically disregarded. However, recently, experiments at Harvard have been showing that subliminal messages can actually affect behaviour in exactly this manner. A Harvard study from 1999 employed a similar method to Vickery's. Subjects played a computer game in which a series of words flashed before them for a few thousandths of a second. One set of subjects got positive words like wise, astute and accomplished, and the others got sets of words like senile, despondent, dependent and diseased. The subjects were then told to complete the task in the game and then leave the room as quickly as possible. Now, despite the fact that these words flashed far too quickly to be consciously perceived, those who received those who received positive words exited the room significantly faster than those who got the negative words. Those who received the negative words struggled to motivate themselves to complete the simple task. Now, subliminal advertising is not actually always necessary, as public opinion can actually be manipulated with a simple headline of a newspaper. Now, in the recent bizarre death of Gareth Williams, as a young man who just so happened to work for MI6, we saw some very strange and lurid newspaper headlines concerning the manner in which he was found. And these included, "Did spy die in S&M game?" "Murdered spook was a cross-dresser." "Suitcase death spy was not gay." And "Police find no evidence that MI6 agent was gay." Now, it doesn't matter that the headline actually merely raises questions about the agent, or in some cases actually refutes accusations. The idea has been planted. Now, the outrageous implication made by the media in this particular case is that homosexuals or transvestites are more likely to be involved in lurid and dangerous sex acts, and therefore his death is more explainable. The details of the case are actually lost in the sensational elements and the sleazy speculation, and then 2 months later, when somebody mentions a young MI6 agent murdered and stuffed naked into a sports bag, you might well say, "Oh, that guy, the S&M guy, wasn't he gay and a cross-dresser?" And this is perfectly natural, but we do this rather than look at the troubling details of the case. Now, this is due to a phenomenon known as source amnesia. For example, we all know what a rose is, I'm sure. but you probably don't remember exactly where you were or when it was or how you actually learned that specific fact. The brain has limited capabilities when it comes to immediate recall of facts, and so to cope with these limitations, it only stores the important points, in this case, give roses on Valentine's Day. But it hides the inconsequential context, such as when and where you learned this, in the deeper recesses of the mind. Now, because of this, the negative words in the headline are reinforced, even if the headline we read was specifically about the rumour being true. Now, you may have seen this is employed heavily during elections. For example, denial of a rumour only serves to keep it in the press and the public consciousness for longer, so the mudslinging comes from all angles. If enough mud is thrown, some of it will eventually stick. TV and films present a codified and a constructed version of reality presented to us as a true depiction of the real world. When we're watching a film, we know that Arnold Schwarzenegger is not really killing all those people. We know that Jodie Foster is not really being raped across that pool table. But we're savvy enough to decode this. We can suspend our disbelief enough to empathise with the emotions of the characters, and we've learnt to deconstruct and accept these symbolic representations. This is the manufacture of consent. Now, just to highlight this, just give you an example. In the BBC soap opera EastEnders, characters always solve their depression and their stress with a glass of neat vodka, to the point where this action can actually be decoded as a sign that the character is in distress. For example, if an episode starts and Peggy comes running down the stairs, immediately bangs back a double vodka, we know, oh, something's up with Peggy, you know, this is it. And this becomes absorbed into the cultural lexicon, so to speak. At the same time, it reinforces and it teaches us week in and week out that this action is a completely legitimate response to a stress situation. Therefore, if you are feeling pressured, a learnt response could be to alleviate the symptoms with the accepted cure, alcohol. Now, in the Ridley Scott extravaganza Gladiator, hopefully you've all seen it, in the opening scene, we're confronted with two snarling, swarthy armies set to do battle. Now, we understand immediately that the Romans, in this case, are the good guys. Now, this is due to several Hollywood conventions. Now, firstly, and most obviously, the star of the film, Russell Crowe, is on the side of the Romans, so we can assume that at least we can trust him. Now, if you go back and watch that, you'll notice that the barbarians are all a bit grubby and a bit swarthy and a bit dirty, so that is another Hollywood convention. The clean person is usually the good guy. And the final convention, which might sound silly, but the Romans have got a dog with them. Now, this might sound trite, this might sound really, really silly, but if you go back and observe the number of films that actually attach an animal to a hero, the concept being that if the dog trusts him, then we as the viewer, we can also trust them. And this is shown again and again. In the 80s cop buddy shoot 'em up Lethal Weapon, we are assured that the clearly insane character played by Mel Gibson must at heart be a gentle soul as his dog consoles him. Now, dogs always seem to know who are the bad guy in films, and thankfully they will alert you by barking at them. Now, this convention, it doesn't work for cats, I'm afraid. Kittens, yes. Cats, no. Cats are for evil geniuses. They're for witches and they're for lonely people, according to Hollywood. Now, early westerns actually used a far simpler denotation of roles. Simply, the bad guy wore black. What you may notice as well is that the hero also moved from left to right across the screen. Now, this was actually more a practicality, so as he's moving from left to right, you can actually see the gun in his right hand. But the convention stuck, so in westerns and in all action films really, you'll find that good guys travel from left to right. Now, we might not consciously realise this, but this subconscious understanding of the convention allows us to make snap judgments of the nature of the characters presented to us on the television screen. Now, television and movies are in this way used to reinforce the concept of normalcy. We can decode representations of characters through the signifiers shown on the screen. A basic example of this is if you see a close-up of somebody's eyes and they're all a bit shifty, or if they're a bit dishevelled, they're probably a bad guy or a villain. If computer geeks, scientists, outsiders and intelligent characters all wear glasses. For some reason, action heroes very rarely have visual impairments. However, there is one film that is slightly different to this. In Tango and Cash, Sylvester Stallone's character actually wears glasses, and he still manages to kill his fair share. However, we're also informed that the character is super intelligent, and therefore you get spectacles with your action spectacle. Cultivation theory is a social experiment named after the results of a series of tests conducted at the University of Pennsylvania, which sought to examine the long-term effects of watching television. The theory was actually developed by sociologists George Gerbner and Larry Gross. Gerbner and Gross preceded their study by arguing that, in their opinion, television had replaced religion as the basic medium of gaining understanding of the world. This was now where we got our representations of what is considered right and wrong. And they said, television is the source of the most broadly shared images and messages in history. Television cultivates from infancy the very predispositions and preferences that used to be acquired from other primary sources. The repetitive pattern of television's mass-produced messages and images form the mainstream of a common symbolic environment. Cultivation theory states that exposure to television over time subtly cultivates viewers' perceptions of the real world. Gerbner and Gross noted that television is a medium of the socialization of most people into the standardized roles and behaviors. Its function, in a word, is enculturation. The way that reality is presented on the television screen is often interpreted and accepted by the cultivated viewer as a true representation of the real world. For example, the more an event is shown in the television, the more significance is placed on this event in the real world by the cultivated viewer. Due to the fact that a large portion of televisual fare depicts violence, drama, crime and dour events, the more often the viewer watches, the more passive and frightened they become. Gerbner termed this mean world syndrome, due to the fact that heavy viewers of television genuinely believe the world to be a far more terrifying place than it actually is. Gerbner discovered that the more a subject viewed the television, the more likely they were to overestimate the levels of danger present in society. The results of his experimentation showed that heavy viewers held far more paranoid and threatened attitudes than light viewers. The paranoia was shown in a heightened belief in rising levels of crime, the belief that themselves would probably become a victim of violent attack, and an exaggerated estimation of the negative aspects of the areas of the city in which they lived. Cultivation theory shows that those who spend more time watching television are more likely to perceive the real world in ways that reflect the most common and recurrent messages presented in the stylized television world. In a 1968 study, Gerbner found that heavy viewers held beliefs and opinions similar to those portrayed on television, as opposed to the true representation of these facts as held by the real world. This serves to highlight the effect that the popular media can have on our perceptions of reality. But this technique is nothing new. As researcher Alan Watt, who has a website, Cutting Through the Matrix, which is excellent, he stated, high drama with emotion plus crisis situation in a movie and drama is a tremendous method of getting points across. It's almost like coupling an idea with the drama, and it's downloaded like a virus into your subconscious and you're being programmed. This is called predictive programming. The technique is ancient and it's an old science. Plato, in his Republic, talks about the culture industry of his own day and how it was essential not only for maintaining control over the public by the elite, but then they had to control everything that was given to the people. In other words, anything that the public saw in drama on stage was authorized by the state. Not only was it authorized, in ancient Greece, travelling troops of players would come into the cities and do their rounds, and it was compulsory to attend. Everyone, even the slaves, had to attend at least one performance, because just like today, they had their agenda and their schedule, and the upgrading of the system, and it was done primarily through fiction. Because the old saying is, monkey see, monkey do, and we, as an audience, emulate what we see, especially when it's done in a typical hero and heroine fashion. The male will project himself into the hero's part and identify with the hero character, and the female will look towards the heroine. This is an ancient, ancient science. Jacques Ellul, who's a French philosopher, a sociologist and a lawyer, postulated in his work, The Technological Society, he said the emergence of the mass media, which makes possible the use of propaganda techniques on a societal scale, The orchestration of press, radio and television to create a continuous, lasting and total environment renders the influence of propaganda virtually unnoticed precisely because it creates a constant environment. Mass media provides the essential link between the individual and the demands of the technological society. And this can be shown, for example, if I was just to ask somebody to portray a gunshot victim, like, what you'll likely do is do the Hollywood, all this sort of stuff, okay? If you've been on WikiLeaks, if you've seen anything, that's not what happens when people get shot. It's far less cinematic than it is in the films. It's sickening and it's sudden. It's not balletic in any sense of the imagination. Also, another example is, can anyone just make the sound of a frog, please? Yes, right, okay, that's not actually the sound of a frog. That's just going to sound weird, but that ribbit ribbit sound is the sound of a California tree frog. What happened was essentially that was the closest frog sound to Hollywood. So this was recorded and put on as a stock sound effect. This stock sound effect was then sent around the world and showed again in hundreds of thousands of films, television programs, radio plays. So we basically absorb it back into the public that frogs go ribbit ribbit. There's dozens and dozens of pitches, tones, there's hundreds of different types of species of frog. There is basically no all-encompassing frog sound. Now, aside from this, we also have a continuing reinforcement in the media that now is the best time that it's ever been. And this is basically the zenith of civilization. And this is shown in programs like Remember the 90s, 10 Things I Hate About 1987, Shameful Secrets of the 80s, for example. And these shows basically show how naive we used to be, how silly we used to be, and how savvy and culturally intelligent we are now. And this basically shows the public that conspiracies cannot be occurring as we are far too clever to be fooled. They are too informed, they're too media savvy, and they have far too much access to too many outlets to be misinformed. They're cosmopolitan and aware, after all. They watch the news and they read a broad selection of newspapers. Now, this obvious buttering up leaves the public in a smug, self-satisfied state, unprepared to admit that in reality things are actually pretty bad. Now, yeah, this gentleman is David Rockefeller. Now, David Rockefeller presented an explanation as to how this is possible in a speech to the Trilateral Commission in June 1991. He said, "We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time magazine and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity during those years. But the world is now far more sophisticated and prepared to march toward world government. The supernatural sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodeterminism practiced in past centuries." Cheers.
I think that was the deliberate conference of 91, no, it's not Ira.
Was it? Oh.
I think so.
You may well be correct. But yeah, you know, his elitist his elitist ideals are clear, and the fact of the collusion with the very top levels of media is also clear. Now, this is actually helped as well by an increasingly narrow number of outlets for the promulgation of news. The number of corporations owning the majority of US media outlets was reduced from 50 to 5 in less than 20 years. And this is shown in Ben Bagdican's book, The Media Monopoly. He says, in 1983, 50 corporations dominated most of every mass medium, and the biggest media merger in history was a $340 million deal. Time Warner, in 2000, AOL Time Warner's $350 billion deal merged a corporation that was more than 1,000 times larger than the biggest deal of 1983. Now, today there are actually 6 media giants that control the vast majority of American news and entertainment at both the local and the national level. The companies are Time Warner, Walt Disney, Viacom, News Corporation, CBS Corporation and NBC International. Sony Corporation, Bertelsmann and Vivendi also control a large portion of media outlets and a large percentage of the world market. The listed companies own and control hundreds of television and radio channels, television shows, production companies, as well as the vast majority of print media and record labels. A list of the properties controlled by AOL Time Warner takes 10 type pages and lists 292 separate companies and subsidiaries. Of these, 22 are joint ventures with other major corporations involved in varying degrees with media operations. These partners include 3Com, eBay, Hewlett-Packard, Citigroup, Ticketmaster, American Express, Home Store, Sony, Viva, Bertelsmann, Polygram, Amazon.com, Book of the Month Club, Little, Brown Publishers, HBO, CNN, Roadrunner, Warner Brothers Studio, Weight Watchers, Popular Science, and 52 major record labels. Now, within this sphere, there is also the scenario of self-censorship by journalists. John Swinton, a highly respected American journalist, famously toasted the New York Press Club in 1953 with this revealing diatribe. He said there is no such thing, by the way, he waited until he'd quit before he decided to actually say this. He said there is no such thing as this date of the world's history in America as an independent press. You know it and I know it. There is not one of you who dares to write your honest opinions, and if you did, you know beforehand that it would never appear in print. I am paid weekly for keeping my honest opinion out of the paper I am connected with. Others of you are paid similar salaries for similar things, and any of you would be foolish as to write honest opinions, would be out on the streets looking for another job. If I allowed my honest opinions to appear in one issue of my paper, before 24 hours my occupation would be gone. The business of journalists is to destroy the truth, to lie outright, to pervert, to vilify, to fawn at the feet of Mammon, and to sell his country and his race for his daily bread. You know it and I know it. And what folly is this, toasting an independent press? We are the tools of rich men behind the scenes. We are jumping jacks. They pull our strings and we dance. Our talents, our possibilities and our lives are all property of other men. We as journalists are intellectual prostitutes. I don't think that's fair because some of them aren't that intellectual. Thank you. Dan Rather, one of the most recognisable anchormen in America, spoke to the BBC and claimed that after 9/11, American reporters were practising a form of self-censorship. He said there was a time in South Africa that people would put flaming tyres around people's necks if they dissented, and in some ways the fear is that you will be necklaced here. You will have a flaming tyre of a lack of patriotism put around your neck. Now, it is that fear that keeps journalists from asking the toughest of the tough questions. And again, I'm humbled to say that I do not accept myself from this criticism. What we are talking about here, whether one wants to recognise it or not, and call it by its proper name or not, is a form of self-censorship. Journalist Keith Olbermann also concurred, stating, "You can rock the boat, but you can never say that the entire ocean is in trouble. You cannot say, by the way, there's something wrong with our system." Bill Moyers, a reporter, also publicly criticised the American corporate media for repeatedly extolling the obviously false link between 9/11 and Iraq and the false claims that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, which the administration enthusiastically parroted in the run-up to the Iraq War. Moyers concluded that the false information was not challenged because the mainstream media had been cheerleaders for the White House from the beginning, and we were simply continuing to rally the public behind the president. No questions asked. Walter Isaacson, the former chairman and the CEO of CNN, revealed there was a patriotism police after 9/11, and when the network showed things critical of the administration's policies, it would get phone calls from advertisers and the administration and also big people in corporations who were calling up and saying, "Stop this, you're being anti-American." Now, the claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction has recently been revealed to be an admitted lie, coming from a single captured terrorist who gave the false information in order to gain leverage in the sentencing for his own crimes. And this was actually reported in the Independent. Curveball, the Iraqi defector who fabricated claims about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, smiles as he confirms how he made the whole thing up. It was a confidence trick that changed the entire course of history, with Rafid Ahmed Alwan al-Janabi's lies being used to justify the war. The chemical engineer claimed to have overseen the building of Mobile Biological Laboratory when he sought political asylum in Germany in 1999. His lies were presented as facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence by Colin Powell, US Secretary of State, when making the case for war at the Security Council in February 2003. US officials sexed up Mr. Janabi's drawings of mobile biological weapons labs to make them more presentable, and this was admitted by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, General Powell's former Chief of Staff. He said, "I brought the White House team in to do the graphics," adding, "Intelligence was being worked to fit the policy." The CNN network has also been exposed as a notorious focal point for Pentagon psychological operations, or PSYOPs. In 2000, the Pentagon confirmed that PSYOPs personnel, soldiers and officers have worked in the CNN headquarters in Atlanta. In February that year, Dutch journalist Abe de Vries reported on the presence of US Army personnel at CNN for the Dutch paper True. In it he said, "Major Thomas Collins, US Information Service has confirmed that PSYOPs personnel, soldiers and officers have worked in the CNN quarters in Atlanta. The Lend-Lease exercise was part of an Army program called Training with Industry. According to Collins, the soldiers and officers worked as regular employees of CNN. Conceivably, they would have worked on stories during the Kosovo War. They did help in the production of news." When asked if the introduction of military personnel into a civilian news organisation was standard operating procedure, one source who worked at CNN said, "To be honest, that question is above my pay grade, but I hope so because it is what I do for a job." Now, the CNN military personnel were members of the Air Mobile 4th Psychological Operation Groups, who were usually stationed out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. One of the many tasks of the almost 1,200 soldiers and officers based at CNN was to spread selected information. Now, critics have said that this basically means dissemination of propaganda, which it does. Now, Andrew Card, the White House chief, explained his decision and the Bush administration's decision to delay the attack on Iraq until September by saying, "From a marketing point of view, you never introduce new products in August." Now, apparently war, like any other state of events, has to be marketed. It has to be bled into the public consciousness in order to be accepted and deemed as normal. To ensure maximum success, specific techniques have to be employed, and there are optimum times to do this to increase effectiveness. Miriam Schulman, the head of the Santa Clara University Center for Applied Ethics, noted the cynical manipulation of public opinion and actually published her thoughts in the same year. She said, "Am I the only one who's queasy that the Bush administration has quite publicly announced plans to sell us on war with Iraq in the same way as a soda pop company might hype a new soft drink?" When interviewed, Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who actually uncovered the Iraq prison torture scandal and also the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, gave a particularly scathing evaluation of the failures within the media industry. He said, "All the institutions we thought would protect us, particularly the press, but also the military, the bureaucracy, the Congress, they have failed. So all the things that we expect would normally carry us through didn't. The biggest failure, I would argue, is the press, because that's the most glaring." And he was asked by the reporter, "So, Seymour, what can be done to fix this situation?" And he had to think about it and said, "Well, you have to fire or execute 90% of the editors and executives. You'd actually have to start promoting people from the newsrooms to be editors. People who you didn't think that you could troll. And to be honest, they're never going to do that." A survey taken in the same year, 2003, revealed that 35% of journalists, reporters and news executives admitted that they regularly avoided stories if the story was thought to be embarrassing or damaging to the financial interests of the news company or the organisation's owners, shareholders or parent companies. Now, I just want you to contemplate these particular phrases with reference to modern news, particularly news that we're seeing recently with Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, all this sort of thing. Propaganda must be planned and executed by only one authority. Credibility alone must determine whether propaganda output should be true or false. Propaganda must label events and people with distinctive phrases or slogans like terrorist, Al-Qaeda, that sort of thing. Propaganda must facilitate the displacement of aggression by specifying the targets for hatred. Black rather than white propaganda may be employed when the latter is less credible or produces undesirable effects. To be perceived, propaganda must evoke the interests of an audience and must be transmitted through an attention-getting communications medium, Fox News Flash. Ever seen that? Propaganda to the home front must create an optimum anxiety level, Fox News Flash. Ever seen that? Right, they're all quotes from Joseph Goebbels. But it would be very easy to see how any of these maxims could actually be applied to today's sensationalist news media. Propaganda can effectively be termed as the deliberate shaping of events, real or perceived, in order to portray a particular pre-designated narrative to an audience. News media is often found guilty of this, and not all incidents can be passed off as an attempt to sensationalise or simplify a story purely to gain a larger audience share. In August 2011, the BBC Persian TV channel acknowledged the role of BBC Persian Radio in the 1953 coup which toppled the democratically elected government of the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The overthrow of Mossadegh led to the restoration of absolute monarchy under dictator Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as reported in Press TV. A documentary aired on August 18th on the anniversary of the coup. BBC Persian channel admitted for the first time to the role of the BBC Persian Radio as the propaganda arm of the British government in Iran. After repeated denials of the BBC Persian Radio's role in helping London oust Mossadegh, the programme detailed how the radio network broadcast anti-Mossadegh propaganda to undermine the government. The British government used the BBC Persian Radio for advancing its propaganda against Mossadegh, and anti-Mossadegh material was repeatedly aired on the radio channel to the extent that the Iranian staff at the BBC went on strike in protest. Another secret government document has since been leaked, and it gave an official summary of America's overthrow of Mossadegh and confirmed the means by which the media was employed in their efforts. In cooperation with the Department of State, CIA had several articles planted in America in major American newspapers and magazines which, when reproduced in Iran, had the desired psychological effect and contributed to the war of nerves against Mossadegh. Famed Watergate reporter Carl Bernstein exposed the fact that the CIA has already bought and paid for many successful journalists. Now, he exposed this in an article that was titled The CIA and the Media, and this was actually published in the music magazine Rolling Stone because this was the only publication that would print it. The article actually forced George Bush Sr. to admit that more than 400 journalists have lived double lives, maintaining covert relationships with the CIA. For proof that this practice is still employed, particularly in the UK, you could always read Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers by David Shayler, which detailed how friendly journalists were being implanted in places like the Telegraph and the Guardian. In the 1950s, CIA agent Frank Wisner proudly and openly stated that he could play the media like a mighty Wurlitzer. Now, this was actually reported in the New York Times in 1997 by Joseph Cruden in an article titled Worldwide Propaganda Network Built by the CIA. Also stated in the article was the fact that in that year the CIA had already published over 1,200 books. Now, this actually led to the bizarre result of one CIA agent secretly working for a national media outlet giving a favourable review to a book written secretly and published secretly by the CIA. In fact, in 1991, a memo was discovered by CIA agent Ralph McGee, which claimed that the CIA had representatives in every single media outlet, representatives that could help shape and alter the news as they wished. The memo said, the PAO, the CIA's Public Affairs Office, now has relationships with reporters from every major wire service, newspaper, News Weekly and television network in the nation. This has helped turn some intelligence failure stories into intelligence success stories. In many instances, we have persuaded reporters to postpone, change, hold or even scrap stories completely. The periodical Armed Forces Journal International revealed that the Pentagon had published 371 separate magazines in the year 1971. Now, this is quite strange because this made the Pentagon 16 times larger than America's largest publishing house. Okay, the number increased to 1,203 different magazines published by the Pentagon by 1982. By the 1970s, a Senate intelligence report revealed that the CIA itself owned outright at least 200 wire services. Now, during the NATO-led regime change of Libya, presented in the West as yet another spontaneous uprising of the people running off the momentum of the Arab Spring, the media publicised false images of celebrations in Tripoli's Green Square, implying that the Gaddafi regime had in fact fallen to the rebels. This was actually shown on Al Jazeera, and it was later repeated on the BBC. This was reported on prisonplanet.com. It said the fake scenery has purportedly been set up in Qatar for purposes of psychological manipulation. The Stop War Crimes website also reports that the footage showing victorious rebels in front of Gaddafi's Al Aziza compound could similarly have been faked. The fake footage serves two purposes, according to the Stop War Crimes blog: to break the Libyan resistance by creating panic and chaos in the Libyan capital, and to provide cover for the massacres of civilians that would occur in the days following the declaration of rebel victory. And this is basically it. Like this was a mock-up. This is the real one. This is a mock-up that was here, that was shown on Al Jazeera, and it was filmed in Qatar. But the article went on to highlight that the fact this is not the first time in recent years that Western media has portrayed the reality of an armed invasion in more sympathetic and ultimately false manner. The toppling of the Saddam Hussein statue in Firdos Square in central Baghdad on April 9, 2003 was the creation of an army psychological operations team that made it appear to be a spontaneous Iraqi undertaking, and this is according to the army's own internal study of the affair. Television pictures at the time showed close-up shots of jubilant Iraqis pulling down the statue as reporters from BBC News and other mainstream commentators boldly proclaimed the scene as an iconic moment in modern history, proving that the invasion of Iraq was really about liberating the people from tyrant and not some sort of crazy geopolitical conquest. However, when the wide shots of the scene were viewed, it became obvious that the event was the work of just a few dozen Iraqis led by Pentagon stooge Ahmed Chalabi, and not thousands of ordinary Iraqi people as the establishment media claimed at the time. This was again confirmed by an internal report commissioned by the army into their own practices and was reported in the Los Angeles Times. As the Iraqi regime was collapsing on April 9, 2003, Marines converged on Firdos Square in central Baghdad, site of an enormous statue of Saddam Hussein. It was a Marine colonel, not joyous Iraqi civilians, as was widely assumed from the TV images, who decided to topple the statue. The army report said, and it was a quick-thinking army psychological operation team that made it appear to be a spontaneous Iraqi undertaking. Now, in the footage, you can clearly see an American soldier draping a US flag across the face of Saddam's statue, followed immediately by another soldier who apparently had a direct line to the Army PSYOPs team, who asked for the flag to be removed. The PSYOPs team said this: they said, "God bless them." But we were thinking that this was just bad news. We didn't want to look like an occupation force, and some of the Iraqis were saying, "No, we want an Iraqi flag." The Stars and Stripes were replaced with an Iraqi flag to imply that this was an organic uprising and portray the coalition of the willing, which is, you remember what we were called at the time, as heroes. But just to explain, this doesn't come out very well. This was a picture that was published on the BBC website that shows scores of dead people with a young child skipping between them. This was actually taken in early 2000 in Iraq. Sorry, this was actually taken in early 2000 in Iraq. This shows scores of dead bodies and a child skipping through. The person who actually took the photo got in touch with the BBC and made a complaint that they were presenting this as the result of massacres in Syria. Not only was it the wrong country, it was completely the wrong year, and the person who actually produced the photo got in touch with them to chastise them about this. In 2011, reports of rioting leading to the shooting of civilians by the Syrian government were flashed across Western media screens. Now, the reports seemed at best incomplete. All were secondary and all were taken from representatives outside of Syria's borders. A fake blog describing the terrible treatment gay women faced in Syria under the present regime circulated widely in the West, and its content was slavishly repeated in several publications. Now, after several weeks, it was actually revealed in the Guardian newspaper that The mysterious identity of a young Arab lesbian blogger who was apparently kidnapped last week in Syria has been revealed conclusively to be a hoax. The blogs were not written by a gay girl in Damascus, but by a middle-aged American man based in Scotland. Tom McMaster, a 40-year-old Middle East activist studying for a master's at Edinburgh University, posted an update declaring that rather than a 35-year-old feminist and lesbian called Amina Abdallah Araf al-Amari, he was the sole author of all posts on his blog. Now, without sounding too paranoid, this type of destabilising perception management technique has all the hallmarks of our own and US intelligence agencies. It is odd to note that McMaster's involvement was only revealed when he had actually relocated from Scotland to Turkey. Now, Turkey is obviously a country that has a vested interest in the destabilisation of Syria. Furthermore, McMaster's wife, Britta Frolicker, is studying at the University of St Andrews for a PhD in Syrian economic development. Now, this is purely speculative, of course, but if, God forbid, there was a Western-sponsored invasion of Syria, PhDs in economic development would be ideally placed for the inevitable rebuilding of the infrastructure. Now, this has not gone unnoticed close to the region, with several journalists from the Al Jazeera news organisation resigning in protest of the biased coverage. A former employee of the Arab satellite network Al Jazeera says the news channel fabricates stories on the unrest in Syria. The facts are totally different from the reports in the media, extremely different. Reuters quoted Moused Ahmed, a former producer for Al Jazeera's Beirut bureau, as saying, Ahmed said the channel concealed many facts, with editors' opinions becoming the so-called facts, adding, I am sorry that we concealed facts for so long a time. Ahmed is one of 5 Al Jazeera employees in Lebanon who resigned from the TV station over the channel's biased stance on Syria in the middle of March. Al Jazeera is also accused of blowing the opposition movement in Syria out of proportion and covering up the truth in the country. It is widely believed that the Emir of Qatar has a direct influence on the nature of programmes broadcast on Al Jazeera. You remember it was Qatar where they filmed the fake Libya things. In addition, the Qatari-based network's biased policy towards Bahrain and Libya has caused dispute among the news network staff. Al Jazeera employees were concerned that the Syrian government was, in their opinion, unfairly being painted as a monster, when in fact the regimes of Bahrain were mercilessly slaughtering its own civilians and citizens, and this was being kept quiet. Many employees at Al Jazeera News Channel are resigning over the Qatari-based network's biased coverage of events taking place in the Middle East. While Al Jazeera has gained a reputation for its coverage of the Tunisian, Egyptian and Libyan revolutions, the broadcaster has remained almost silent over the massive anti-government protests in Bahrain and Myanmar's brutal crackdown on the popular uprising. Al Jazeera is also accused of fabricating whole stories about Libya and Syria and even staging its own footage at undisclosed locations. Al Jazeera is also said to be forcing editors to give the stories a twist to benefit the state of Qatar's political views. Yes, a famous incident of media misinformation occurred on the afternoon of 9/11. The BBC reported that the Solomon Brothers building, also known as World Trade Center Building 7, had collapsed. The live shot of the reporter at the scene in New York had the Solomon Brothers building in clear view, still standing just over the reporter's left shoulder. There it is. Okay, despite this seemingly glaring elephant in the room, the field reporter and the in-studio anchor repeated the obviously premature statement that the building had collapsed. Mysteriously, seconds prior to the actual collapse of the building, the live feed disintegrated in a shower of electrical interference. This is literally 5 minutes before the building actually collapsed. Now, I'm not going to go as far as some have gone, right? Okay, I'm not accusing the BBC of being involved in the attack. I'm not even going to go as far as to say they had prior knowledge of the events that would unfold that day, right? Personally, and some might disagree, but I don't even believe that the reporters shown on the screen were aware that the information they were regurgitating was at that point false. What this does prove, however, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that journalists and news media organisations do not check the facts in all cases before slavishly repeating them as gospel. The media is becoming more cut and paste, with journalists acting more like mouthpieces for an organisational standpoint. They repeat the pre-typed scripts laid before them mere seconds after rushing out of makeup.
The question is therefore, is this type of mistake an unfortunate result of an industry that demands more and more in a field of dramatic presentation to the detriment of truth, or is this not a mere oversight but the purposeful tactic of some malignant agency? Propaganda is essential in framing any foreign intervention, and specifically for positioning ourselves as the heroes fighting some monstrous, inhuman adversary. We have to demonise on the microcosm in army training to allow for the recruits to be able to kill another human, but also in the macrocosm to justify and normalise the ensuing death and destruction in the minds of the public. Essentially, we need to justify the deaths to two groups of people: those who actually carry out the grim slaughter, and the masses who, by implication, allow it to happen. From the very beginning of the First World War, Wellington House, the precursor to the Tavistock Institute, spread spurious stories about the advancing German army's treatment of Belgian civilians. Eyewitness accounts spread through the media told of numerous atrocities, specifically German troops impaling babies on their bayonets, dismembering children so that they could not grow old and seek violent retribution, and amputating the breasts of women for their own cruel enjoyment. Tales of mass organised rapes were also commonplace, and the scenarios often had similar characteristics. The women of a village were supposedly gathered up, often thrown over a table in the town square, and gang raped while the rest of the German soldiers cheered encouragement and waited their turn. These reports, it should be added, were never ever substantiated, and were actually were vigorously denied, not only by the German army but also by Allied reporters that were in the area covering the developments of the war. Kaiser Wilhelm in the First World War was portrayed in propaganda as a ruthless brute and was given the nickname the Butcher of Berlin. Now, prior to the First Gulf War, the Western media was awash with reports that Iraqi troops in Kuwait were dragging newborn babies from incubators and dashing them to death on the cold concrete floors. Televised and repeated everywhere was the tearful eyewitness account of these murders by a young girl to President George Bush. Now, this was apparently influential in swaying his opinion to seek permission from the Senate to begin attacking Iraq. The stories transpired to be a complete and total fabrication, and they were admittedly the product of the imaginations of Hilton and Knowles. Hilton and Knowles is a public relations agency with ties and funding from the Tavistock Institute in London. And this was a crafted falsehood designed to snare the moral justification of the war in the eyes of the general public. This is the girl in question. She tearfully recounted her horrific memories of the atrocities. Now, this girl just so happened to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the US, and she'd met President George Bush literally dozens of times. Her father was friends with George Bush, and she'd been to the White House many times. Quite how he failed to recognise her when she spoke in front of him remains to this day to be a mystery. But to be fair, it could be that his vision was completely clouded with tears. But I'm afraid I don't believe that. Now, the second illegal invasion of Iraq was predicated on two things. Firstly, an unproven and false link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. And secondly, the Iraqi army's mythical and yet as still undiscovered weapons of mass destruction. If you remember, Colin Powell held up an empty glass vial and said that if it was full of poisonous gas, it could be very dangerous indeed. Tony Blair also claimed falsely that Iraq could attack UK citizens in Cyprus within 45 minutes. This was actually presented in the public as they could attack England within 45 minutes. Both of these claims turned out to be false. Regardless of the obvious fraud, the public opinion was actually favourable enough to invade. Now, this is despite mass street protestations and the highly suspicious suicide of Dr. David Kelly, a weapons inspector who publicly accused the government of sexing up reports. A remarkable number of the general public felt that the invasion was actually justified. Even if people felt that the propaganda was false or that the true nature of the action was a crusade to secure oil, the fact that we were there to remove the the butcher of Baghdad, this mythical figure, was in some people's views enough, regardless of to how much this demonisation was accurate or Western propaganda. Now, the fictional rape scenario also reared its ugly head again during the 2011 NATO liberation of Libya. Reports circulated in the Western media that soldiers loyal to Gaddafi had been equipped with the erectile dysfunction drug Viagra and ordered to indiscriminately and violently rape any and every woman that they happened across. These stories are remarkably similar to those told during the First World War, and once again they were discovered and proven to be complete and total fabrications. Sir Stuart Campbell, who worked with Lord Northcliffe of Wellington House fame, Wellington House being the precursor to Tavistock, they worked together at Crewe House, which was another British wartime propaganda factory, and he explained how you would create effective propaganda. He said, "Creation of a favourable atmosphere is the first object of propaganda. Until this psychological effect is produced as the result of military events, propagandist activity or internal political disaffection, the mentality of enemy troops and civil population, and both are equally important in modern warfare, will be naturally unsympathetic and unresponsive to influence. In order to produce this atmosphere of receptivity and susceptibility, continuity of propaganda policy is indispensable." So basically this is what we're talking about. We're talking about creating an atmosphere where people feel that regardless of civilian deaths and stuff like that, this guy is such a bad guy, Colonel Gaddafi, Ahmadinejad, Hussein, that's all that we focus on essentially. Now, it might be interesting to note that Lord Northcliffe of Crewe House and Wellington House was the proprietor of the Times and the Daily Mail. Wellington House also included Lord Beaverbrook, who owned the Daily Express, and he was the Minister of Propaganda Information. I also find it slightly amusing that the Daily Mail in the 30s were involved in anti-Nazi propaganda, but, you know, fair enough. Both sides of the fence, apparently. In September 2011, the ITV television network in the UK apologised after footage it broadcast in a documentary said to be from an IRA propaganda video was exposed to be in fact a cutscene from a computer game. The pictures were used in the documentary Exposure, which tried to show a spurious link between Colonel Gaddafi and the IRA. The footage, labelled IRA Film 1988, was reportedly of terrorists using Libyan rocket launchers to bring down a helicopter, but was in reality from the war simulation game Arma 2. This is all taken from a computer game. A statement from ITV claimed, "The events featured in Exposure, Gaddafi and the IRA, were genuine, but it would appear that during the editing process the correct clip of the incident was not selected and other footage was mistakenly included in the film. This was an unfortunate case of human error for which we apologise." Now, to me, this seems a bit too much of a coincidence, considering at the time the media was pushing for a NATO-led intervention into Libya, and this appeared to be instead to be a case of poorly executed demonisation tactics. Genuine footage of this reported attack, or actually any confirmation that the incident took place at all, has never come forward. So we're to assume that not only is the footage fake, but the incident was a lie too. In December 2011, Fox News repeatedly showed footage from the recent austerity riots in Greece, whilst trying to claim that we were watching destruction on the streets of Moscow in reaction to the re-election of Putin, or for the forthcoming elections. This was despite the fact that a Greek bank with the sign written in Greek alphabet stood in the background. Many of these Russian activists were actually wearing t-shirts, which is not entirely suitable for a Moscow December. Right, I'm going to go slightly off script here. Okay, everyone's seen Pussy Riot, this band, Pussy Riot, yeah? Anyone fell for it? No. Good. Right, I wanted to tell you a few things. Pussy Riot, for those people that don't know, is an anarcho-punk band that basically broke into a church in Russia, performed what they called a punk's prayer, and then were basically arrested, and they've been thrown in prison for 2 years, and this has been vilified in the Western press. Dozens and dozens of celebrities, musicians, politicians, everybody under the sun has got behind this band, Pussy Riot. Now, first thing I want to say is they're not a band. They don't play instruments. They have no songs. They have performed no punk actions, no activist actions, except for the one that got them into trouble. Okay. Secondly, they now have a song out on which none of the members of the band play instruments, although I think one of them sings. This song was financed, produced, and recorded by the American State Department. Exactly. I'd also like to point out that, okay, I have no care one way or the other about what they did, but if they did what they did in America, not only would they be there for 2 years, they'd be there for possibly 10 years. The result of their actions could have resulted in a 10-year prison sentence in America. So this concept of Russia being terrible to these people is nonsense. It's absolute garbage. What it is there for is it's a very, very subtle destabilisation process. What we're seeing, you know, because in the next couple of weeks, when we try to invade Syria, Iran or any of those places, Russia are basically there going, this isn't a good idea. The general public will go, yeah, but Russia are mentalists. They throw women in prison for 2 years for making a public statement. So please don't fall for it. There's been several other things that have happened actually recently. The nude pictures of Kate Middleton. The nude pictures of Prince Harry. Does anyone believe for a second, you know, if you can get a telephoto lens strong enough to actually see Kate Middleton's naked body, you could get a sniper's scope there as well. Are we really believing that the security on the princess is that lax? Or is this yet another example of trying to normalise these people? They're just like you and me. They're just like, oh, poor them. I feel embarrassed for them, poor girl. Like, it's rubbish. Please don't buy it. Same thing with the recent chief whip insulting the police. Again, who cares, to be quite honest? But I did notice that this was a fabulous distraction away from the results of the Hillsborough result. It's a fabulous distraction away from the lies that are being told in the Mark Duggan inquest. And it's also a fabulous distraction from the death of Ian Tomlinson at the G20. Anyway, back to the script. Now, to prove that this sort of thing happens a lot, political journalist Peter Oborne stated on the BBC's Newswipe programme that collusion between media and government stretches down to a very, very detailed and precise level. In 2003, the UK's Sun newspaper launched a campaign against asylum seekers in Britain with a series of sensationalist headlines such as "Halt the Asylum Tide Now," "The Biggest Crisis Facing the UK Today," and "Our Heritage is Crumbling." The campaign was, on the face of it, very critical of the then Labour government. The culmination of the Sun's operation was an interview with the then Home Secretary David Blunkett, who was forced to admit, "I can't argue with the Sun over asylum." The newspaper had seemingly taken up a cause that was pressing in the minds of the public and forced the reluctant government into action, which was presented not only as a victory for the Sun, but also for the general public whom the paper was championing. Journalist Peter Oborne later managed to find a copy of what was known as the Downing Street Grid. Now, this is a month-by-month calendar of upcoming and important media and social events pertaining to the government. To his surprise, Oborne discovered that that particular month's calendar, printed weeks before the Sun campaign, actually contained the very campaign that appeared in the newspaper in incredible detail, including the date and the content of the future Blunkett interview. The grid also detailed how the government would react to the Sun campaign in the public. Now, this means that the campaign that the Sun presented as a spontaneous and organic attack on asylum seekers and government procedure on behalf of the people was in fact part of the government's own public relations policy. This was nothing more than an orchestrated performance which served to trick the public into believing that they had an effect on the government, and more importantly, that the government and their media were listening to their opinion. And this is by no means an isolated incident. The relationship between the media and the government is far more Machiavellian than we would actually believe. It's not about facts or critical analysis, but perception management. Who controls the past and who controls the present? As Orwell stated, who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. For examples of control of information to shape public opinion, one need only examine the mainstream portrayal of the deaths of Dr. David Kelly, Charles de Menez, Osama bin Laden. Even the mainstream media cites certain discrepancies within the facts of all of their deaths. Hitler famously stated, "The bigger the lie, the more people will believe it." Goebbels is paraphrased as stating, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." Napoleon proclaimed that history is written by the winners. Fox News claims to be fair and balanced. Now, despite their genocidal tendencies, in this particular case, the three tyrants are actually significantly more honest than the news media. Now, the CIA has never been shy about courting the media. William Colby, the former director, was cited by Dave McGowan in Derailing Democracy as making this astonishing claim. The CIA owns everyone of any significance in the major media. A CIA operative discussing the availability and prices of journalists willing to peddle agency propaganda and cover stories was quoted in the book Catherine the Great by Deborah Davis as boldly stating, "You could get a journalist cheaper than a good call girl for a couple $100 a month." William Bader, a former CIA intelligence officer, announced when briefing members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, "There is quite an incredible spread of relationships. You don't need to manipulate Time magazine, for example, because there are CIA agency people at the management level." And this was reported in the article "The CIA and the Media" by Carl Bernstein, which we touched on earlier. And in the same article, it had this claim: "The agency's relationship with the New York Times was by far its most valuable among newspapers. According to CIA officials, it was general policy to provide assistance with the CIA whenever possible. According to declassified CIA documents, ABC News was also used as a cover for active agents in the 1960s. Now, the CIA or the MI6 are not the only controlling forces to utilise the media for their own ends. Industrial concerns also influence the facts that we are fed through the media. Under law, the director of a company is obliged to act in the interests of his own company. An unanswered dilemma is what happens when an officer of Corporation A, who sits as a director on the board of Corporation B, has to choose between acting in the best interests of his own company or one on whose board he sits. What is the proper behaviour of a banker who is a director of General Electric, owner of NBC, if he hears that the network is about to produce a documentary highly embarrassing to the banking industry? It could be that the best interests of NBC News to attract an audience with a documentary on what could be a compelling public issue. Yet, such a documentary might not be perceived as being in the best interests of the banks, and in such cases, that documentary would not go ahead, because as I've stated, it is illegal for somebody to do something to the detriment of their shareholders, which is insane. The emergence of major national and multinational corporations as collectors of controllers of most of the country's media has enormously complicated the potential conflicts of interest in, among other things, interlocked boards of directors. A study by Peter Dreyer and Stephen Weiberg in 1979 found interlocked directors in major newspaper chains. For example, Gannett, which is a publishing house, shared directors with Merrill Lynch, Standard Oil, 20th Century Fox, Kerr McGee, who are an aerospace and nuclear power company, McDonnell Douglas Aircraft, McGraw-Hill, Eastern Airlines, Phillips Petroleum, Kellogg's, and the New York Telephone Company. The most influential paper in America, the New York Times, interlocked with Merck, Morden Guarantee, Bristol Myers, Charter Oil, Johns Manville, American Express, Bethlehem Steel, IBM, Scott Paper, Sun Oil, and the First Boston Corporation. Time, Inc. has so many interlocks that they almost represent a plenary board of directors of US business and finance. They interlock with Mobil Oil, AT&T, American Express, Firestone, Trim and Rubber Company, Mellon National Corporation, Atlantic Richfield, Xerox, General Dynamics, and most major international banks. In the early 1970s, New York Times publisher Arthur Sulzberger admitted that he and his editors censored stories concerning automobile safety and pollution concerns due to the worry of affecting advertising revenue. In an interview with Herman Held on CBS television in 1983, it was stated that advertising agencies were always taken into account in order not to offend them during the production of television pieces. So, when media outlets are proven, at the very least, to make errors in the accuracy of their reporting, why do we, the general public, still turn to them as the authoritative oracle of truth? You see, we have established belief structures that are supported by the society we live in. endorsed continuously by the various media outlets that envelop us. Psychologically, this is very comforting to the individual as it builds a sense of security and a similarity of consciousness through which we feel part of a wider protective group. The established norms and accepted truths of any given society are vigorously defended by the members of the general public and backed up by the opinions of authority figures, namely the media, academia, and general established folk knowledge. Beliefs that question or critique the status quo can be met with anger and confusion. Facts, no matter how elegantly presented, are often dismissed out of hand if they prove something that an individual simply does not want to believe. Now this is due to the psychological processes at work reinforcing the perceived attributes of the protective mass in which we wallow. To protect the idea of the larger whole to which we psychologically attach ourselves, we will become willfully ignorant of anything we happen to learn that does not come from prescribed channels of information. This is why subjects that are deemed conspiratorial are often dismissed or ridiculed with no attention being given to the evidence. The problem is that if we question one aspect of our perceived reality which turns out to be different to our expectations, this suggests that other things we have taken as given facts may also turn out to be untrue. Not only do we not want to feel duped as an individual, an easy rube who can be manipulated against our will, but we also don't want to believe that the beast to whose belly we cling so tightly for protection may not have our best interests at heart. Psychologist Charles Tart, formerly of the University of California, calls this phenomenon consensus trance. Tart believes that the collective society literally convinces itself that certain facts are self-evident, and in this way we are willingly hypnotized into a particular way of thinking. Consensus trance, an automated state of consciousness, actually the normal consciousness, based on the premise that people believe what they are told to be true as opposed to what they have themselves realized to be true. A very basic example of this is that we, whoever we are always presented as the good guys in any military conflict. We know we're the good guys because the media constantly reinforces this, explaining the necessity for any intervention and the noble and honourable intentions of our leaders. This manifests itself often as unquestioning support of the government and the troops and a particular type of rabid patriotism, which is essentially a refusal to hear anything negative about your home country. Tart explained that the general public consents to a perceived view of reality presented to us by the powers that be in return for the psychological benefits that we receive. We collectively decide what is and what is not considered a reliable source of information. States of consciousness, from altered states to the state earthlings call normal waking consciousness, have been Charles Tart's speciality for 2 decades. Dr. Tart no longer calls it normal consciousness. He has substituted what he feels to be a more accurate term, consensus trance. To him, the idea of normal consciousness is the kind of convenient fiction illustrated by the famous folktale of the Emperor's New Clothes. Together, human groups agree on what their perception should be admitted to awareness, hence consensus. Then they train each other to see the world in that way and only in that way, hence trance. Tart went on to explain that if it is not in the media or academia, it does not happen and does not exist. If it did not happen and does not exist, but is in the media, including higher education, then we accept it and believe it. To protect our concept of reality, for which we have so much of our psyche invested, we turn to the media outlets as the established and accepted sources of truth to tell us exactly how the world really is. For the most part, this works very well, as the various media outlets, in their differing ways, serve only to reinforce the established status quo. It is also easier to blindly accept that the news, for example, is factual, accurate, and has no agenda dictating the topics presented, rather than admit we have been tricked and begin to unravel the web of lies. Sadly, therefore, we see that the media is not always reliable. Newspapers and televised news have a duty to draw in an audience and may be inclined to lead towards more entertaining and sensational aspects of the story in order to increase sales. More disturbing, though, is the fact that news outlets may not be the impartial organisations that they present themselves as. They have allegiances to far larger corporate entities that may affect our reception of facts in ways that we would not normally consider. Okay, well that concludes my talk, so thank you very much. Thank you very much, and I'll hand you back to Andrew.
Well, what a fantastic talk by Neil there, and you can see just from what he's gone through an incredible amount of research, and I think it's set the tone for, you know, really thinking about what you're going to see today and how exactly what Neil's talked about covers up conveniently, you know, what we're going to talk about later. So I'd really like to thank Neil for a wonderful bit of research, and I look forward to getting hold of a copy of his book when it becomes available soon, and I believe it's going to be sold through Richard Hall's website. So
Hopefully.
you know, we don't have to turn it into a book promo, of course, but you know, it's important. I think from what the way Neil presented the information, I think it's going to make it accessible to people who are not. I know there's many people in this room, probably at different levels. Some people know, you know, very great detail about what we're talking about, and some not as much. So I think Neil's book will probably be a good introduction to this understanding that media covers things up. So thanks again, Neil, and thank you.
Thank you.